This is Curious Minnesota, a Star Tribune project that sends staff from the state's largest newsroom hunting for the answers to great questions we receive from you, our readers. We're here to answer everything you want to know about the state's people, places, and culture.
Welcome to Curious Minnesota. I'm your host, Eric Roper. Today's episode of Curious Minnesota is sponsored by Primrose Schools. I think my first introduction to gambling in Minnesota was when I was a young reporter working in a lonely press office in the basement of the Capitol. Back then, lobbyists and other groups would stop by unannounced to talk about some issue that they were promoting. And one day, a lobbyist came in and he showed me a pull tab. You know, there was this push at the time to allow for electronic pull tabs, which have since helped pay for the Minnesota Vikings stadium. But I had no idea what this thing was. It was this small piece of cardboard with little tabs that you rip off to expose icons, kind of like the, cherries and things that you might see on an old-fashioned slot machine. Of course, now I know that pull tabs are a big deal in many bars across Minnesota, and it's the state's most popular form of charitable gambling. I'm talking about this because today's show is about the history of gambling in Minnesota. Half a century ago, gambling was largely illegal in the state. But in the latter half of the 20th century, rules gradually loosened. And now you can play slot machines at a casino, buy scratch-off tickets at a gas station, bet on horses at a racetrack, or rip open pull tabs at your favorite bar. Reader Rob Clone wanted to know more about how this all came to be. Here's Rob.
The question occurred to me a couple months ago when some states around the nation were starting to really change their view and their stance on legalized gambling and sports gambling more specifically. That transpired into kind of the history of how did we get to casinos that we have in our state, why they're typically Native American owned and operated. So it started with sports gambling, and then it kind of transpired into what's the entire history. So that's how the question came to be in my head.
Thanks to Rob for that question. Joining me today is reporter Alex Chhith, who wrote a story on this topic for Curious Minnesota. Well, Alex, thanks so much for joining us today. So first of all, what do you do here at the paper? What's your role?
Yeah, I'm a home and gardens reporter, and I've been doing that for a couple years. So I write stories basically about people's houses, the architecture behind it, and also plants. So
cool.
All the good stuff.
Yeah. And so this story was not related to your beat, but what kind of got you interested in this topic?
I used to work in Las Vegas, and, I used to cover a lot of what the casinos did. And I came back here and I started wondering, where are all the casinos? Just because it's such a major industry in Las Vegas. And so that's what kind of drew me to the story growing up here. I used to only go to Mystic Lake, but I don't know if I've ever been to any other casinos in the state before.
And you grew up here in the region?
Yeah, I grew up here, and I would always see, other casinos driving, maybe on my way to Duluth or taking other road trips, but I never stepped foot in them. So.
Right. Yeah. And so we have all these gambling options these days. You mentioned casinos, but that's just one of the many things. What other kind of things can people do if they want to go gambling?
Yeah. I mean, this Minnesota State Lottery is a form of gambling, which you can do at any gas station. And then there's also pull tabs, which is a really big industry here, and bingo as well.
Right.
So.
Yeah, pull tabs are like this kind of bar social and now they're electronic.
Yeah.
You don't have to rip them anymore. You can do it on like an iPad, basically.
You don't, but I do know a lot of people who they like that feeling of paper in their hand.
Yeah. With Curious Stories sometimes, what I'm always interested in is when there's a topic that seems like it's kind of self-evident or obvious, and then you dig into it and something is very surprising. I think in this case, the surprising fact was that a lot of this was pretty new. I mean, like this state was really anti-gambling for most of its history. So we have to kind of go way back in time here to the founding of Minnesota. What was sort of the line on gambling back then?
Yeah. Even before Minnesota became a state, gambling was illegal in the territories. And then when Minnesota started writing its constitution, it actually wrote in there prohibiting lotteries.
Okay. And so basically you have this constitution bars lotteries, and then you have state laws that then have a full prohibition, essentially, sort of following through on the theme of that constitution.
Yeah.
Okay. And what's this all about? I mean, like, why were people so concerned about gambling?
At the time, people were more conservative. They held their religious values close, and they thought that gambling would cause corruption in youth and promoted idleness. So it just wasn't really seen as productive.
Right. Okay. You spoke to Bill Convery at the Minnesota Historical Society, and he's noting that it's happening anyway. It's like happening all over town. And people are getting scammed, essentially.
Yeah.
This is an early statehood period.
Yeah. I mean, people were basically doing it anyways, and it was a very shadowy industry. There's a lot of fraudulent activity. Sometimes winners wouldn't get their payout, and it would go to maybe the person operating the machines or other cronies.
Okay. And so this kind of leads into this like early 20th century period where there's some very like intense visuals of these raids. Tell me about these raids, because we have a lot of photos of them because reporters were sort of like brought in on these things, essentially.
The police would basically break up these gambling rings. And before they did it, they would tip off news reporters that they were going to do it just so they can get great photos of them smashing up these slot machines and roulette tables with, just like wood spraying everywhere.
Yeah.
And so they just really wanted the public to know what a hard line they took against gambling.
Right.
So.
And I'd recommend people go check out the story. I'll put a link in the show notes and see some of those images because they're really, they're quite violent. They're taking like axes to these there's no reason to do that, but they're like, it kind of reminds me of like during Prohibition when there's all these like videos of people just breaking bottles all the time. And it's like a very, like they have to show how against it they are, something like that.
Yeah. They are pretty great photos.
So the sentiment starts to sort of change. Is it after World War II then?
Yeah. After, the U.S. goes through a couple of wars, I think Minnesotans just wanted to relax a little bit, have some fun. And so we legalized bingo in 1945. But only for charitable reasons.
Okay. And so tell us about what is charitable gambling? Because this is sort of a new concept then at the time.
I think back in the 1940s, people were just still gambling, and it was seen as just this terrible vice. And people thought, well, if we're just going to do this anyways, we might as well do it for a good cause.
Mm-hmm.
Like, nonprofits or charities, what have you. So
okay, so you could have bingo, but it would have to be going to some sort of charitable type organization or something like that. Okay.
Exactly.
And so now we have other charitable gambling, but that doesn't come around until like 30 years later. So all we had was bingo for a long time, and then the rest of it is like the 70s. And what's the new stuff then?
Yeah, it wasn't until like the 1970s that we legalized paddle wheels, tip boards, raffles, and pull tabs. And pull tabs is still a major form of charitable gambling to this day. So
I mean, it's the majority of charitable gambling is now pull tabs.
Yeah, about 95%. So
wow. Okay. So, all right. So that gets us into the 70s. So now we're loosening up. It has to go to a charitable cause. Now let's talk about casinos. So in your reporting, you found that actually there was a Minnesota tax case that helped lay the groundwork for like Native American casinos nationally. Tell us a little bit about this case.
Yeah. In the early 1970s, a couple, Helen and Russell Bryan, were members of the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe tribe. And she was kind of a cash-strapped mom at the time. She was a teacher, and Itasca County officials had assessed her property, and she, didn't really have the money to pay for it. And so she went to a lawyer, told them, I can't pay this. And the lawyer took a very hard line of, you can't tax Native people on Native land.
Okay. And so the lawyer fights this, and it goes all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court?
It does. And they actually ruled in favor of the couple, saying that, no, you can't tax Native people on Native land. So
okay. And so the precedent for that case, what is it sort of establishing?
Basically, the U.S. Supreme Court said that the state of Minnesota does not have regulatory civil authority on Native land. They only have criminal authority.
Okay. And so that case then becomes the foundation of another case in 1987, which is really considered sort of the landmark ruling for or allowing for Native American casinos.
Yeah, it was a backbone in that case. And the Supreme Court justices had actually referenced back to the Minnesota case, saying that gambling is a civil matter and the state does not have any rights to regulate that.
Okay. We'll be right back.
At Primrose, our balanced learning approach means exploring academic skills and life skills, combining purposeful play with nurturing guidance from teachers, and setting children up for success in future classrooms. Learn more at primroseschools.com/Twin Cities.
And we're back. And so that ruling in 87, the next year is when there's like the federal law that then enshrines this into sort of, it makes it very clear that that is allowed.
Later in 1988, Congress passes the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, which fully establishes, I guess, that casinos can operate on native land. So
okay. And so nowadays there's how many casinos in Minnesota?
Now we have 18.
Okay. And I think someone in the story, pointed out, or maybe it was in one of the law articles you cited, that this has been a big boon for Native Americans in the state.
Yeah. It sent billions of dollars into Native communities. And it's probably, in some communities, one of the biggest economic developments.
Okay. All right. So then the next frontier, we've been talking about all this loosening over time of the rules and allowing for more gambling. And there's still a live issue at the Capitol on this topic, which is sports betting. Why are we talking about sports betting all of a sudden? Why not talk about it 20 years ago? What changed?
In 2018, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that a 1992 federal law regulating sports betting was unconstitutional. And so a lot of states started legalizing sports betting after that ruling. But Minnesota remains just one of 12 states that doesn't allow it still.
Okay. And what's the controversy? What is sort of being hashed out there at the Capitol?
Yeah. it seems like the primary debate is over who would control sports gambling and how the revenue would be split between tribes and Minnesota's 2 horse race tracks.
Okay. So you have casinos in the that's in the late 80s, but other things are happening in the 80s too. So tell me about horse racing and then the lottery.
It was surprising to me that in my research, the Minnesota State Lottery, which was legalized in 1988, I grew up here. I was born in the 90s, so I just had no idea that this was illegal before.
And that was actually, they had to change that part of the Constitution we talked about earlier, right?
Yes, there had to be a constitutional amendment just to override that. And so the issue came before voters, and they decided to legalize it in the state.
Okay, and then so betting on horse racing, it actually happened a couple years earlier in 1983?
Yeah, you are allowed to bet on horse racing starting in 1983. And now we have 2 racetracks where you can do that in Minnesota.
Okay, so like Running Aces and Canterbury Park.
Yep.
Got it. Okay, so now, as we've talked about, this is a fairly recent phenomenon, and now gambling is this major industry in the state.
So the Minnesota Lottery continues to see record sales every year, and about 40% of that goes back into the state's environmental fund.
Okay. And then charitable gambling also doing very well.
Yes. Charitable gambling in and of itself is a $5 billion industry.
Wow.
But, a lot of that goes back into prizes. Pull tabs has about an 80% win rate. And then also a lot of it goes into taxes.
But then these nonprofits also get a cut. That's why they're doing it.
Yeah. So a lot of organizations that benefit from charitable gambling include like hockey associations in the state.
And so the casino revenue, though, is a little bit more mysterious.
Yeah. The National Indian Gaming Commission does not post state-specific figures, but nearly 100 casinos that are spread across Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Indiana, they generate about $5 billion in revenue.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for working on this. Again, I think it's sort of surprising how recent all this is, I think, as you just talked about.
Yeah, it was surprising just knowing that we were so against gambling for so much of the state's, existence.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a really fun thing to, I think, report on. So I just didn't know how big gambling was in Minnesota.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Alex.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, that's it for today's show. Thanks, as always, to Matt Gilmer for editing this podcast. Got feedback for us or a question you'd like us to tackle? Send us a note at curious@startribune.com. And if you're enjoying this show, please tell a friend about it. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Curious Minnesota. We want to hear from you. Ask questions and read more stories online at startribune.com/curious. Our show is recorded at the Star Tribune's headquarters in beautiful downtown Minneapolis, and our music is produced by Matt Gilmer. If you like the show, please rate us on iTunes or leave a review. And until next time, stay curious.